Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this introductory seminar on the green status of species. So my name is Rima Jabado, and I'm the chair of the IUCN Shark Specialist Group. And within the Shark Specialist Group, you all know that we've worked a lot on red list assessments. And some of you may have wondered why you suddenly have something that looks like this online next to a red list assessment. So this new green kind of little dot that has appeared. And this reflects a new standard that has been developed by IUCN to measure the effectiveness of conservation actions using a metric of species recovery. So this new standard, and I think Molly might talk about this a little more, has only been applied to 8 sharks and 1 Chimaera species. And so it's still very new for us. And we wanted to try and provide you all with an overview of this framework and how it can and how it has been applied to some of these species. So I'd like to welcome and thank our 4 speakers for today. Dr. Molly Grace, who's the co-chair of the IUCN Green Status of Species Working Group, and who's going to give us an overview of this new framework. Then we've got Dr. Polo, who's going to talk to us about this application to the blue shark, Dr. Gonzalo Araujo talking about the whale shark, and Dr. Charlie Huveneers, who sent in a video on how it was applied to the banded wobbegong. We're going to have a question and answer period at the end of the seminar, so please feel free to put any questions in the chat in the meantime. And with that, I'll pass it on to Molly. Thank you, Molly.
Well, thank you so much, Rima, for hosting this event and for inviting me and all the other speakers along. And, you know, as Rima just said, only 8 elasmobranchs have been assessed for the new IUCN Green Status of Species. But in terms of taxonomic representation within a specialist group, the Shark Specialist Group has been one of the most involved, one of the most enthusiastic with helping us figure out how to make the green status of species and how to apply it to the sharks and rays and elasmobranchs that you're all responsible for. So it's a real pleasure to be here today, and hopefully I'll be able to give a nice quick overview of what the green status is trying to do, and then I'll turn over to the experts to talk about how it's been applied with some shark species. Let me just share my screen very quickly. Great. Hopefully everyone can see that okay. So as I said, I'm just going to give a very basic introduction to the green status of species. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the shark and chimera assessments that have been done. I'll leave that to the others on the call, but just have a quick chat about how the concept works. So the green status of species, it is an idea that has been rolling around in IUCN since 2012. And the driving idea behind the development of the green status of species is we wanted to answer the question, when has a species recovered? And you might think that that is, you know, a simple thing to ask or something we already had some idea about how to answer that question, but there was no standardized way of thinking about species recovery until the green status of species. And so that was really the driving force behind development. So traditionally, when we've thought about conservation success, we've had the amazing tool of the IUCN Red List of threatened species as sort of a benchmark for looking at progress in conservation of a species. So with the Red List, we have a way to think about our species moving from a higher risk of extinction to a lower risk of extinction. And of course, as everyone on this call knows, the Red List breaks that spectrum of extinction risk down into the categories that we're all familiar with. However, when we start thinking about species recovery, we start thinking about the green status, the question, is avoiding extinction enough, becomes really important. So what does it really mean if a species is least concern in terms of its extinction risk? Have we achieved all of the goals that we want to have achieved for conservation just because a species is least concern? And one classic terrestrial example that I use to talk about this is the puma. Puma concolor, you might know it also by the names cougar or mountain lion, or even panther. And the puma is currently a least concern species. It has a very huge geographic range in the Americas. However, as you can see on this map here, the dark green areas are the areas where pumas are currently extant, but there are so many orange areas where the puma is extinct. So we have a species that is clearly least concern in terms of its extinction risk. Given this huge range, the number of pumas on the planet, it's not going to go extinct anytime soon, so least concern is a very appropriate label for this species. However, what do we do with all of this extirpated range? How do we think about that in terms of conservation? And this is potentially really important, especially for a species like the puma, because when you remove pumas from an ecosystem, you're removing a top predator. And so removing that top predator can have trophic cascades that descend all through the different levels of the trophic system. And so you're not just losing the species from parts of its range, you're losing the functions of a species. And so one could argue that this is something that we want to be thinking about when we're thinking about conservation goals and aims for a species. And so really, one of the other driving factors behind the development of the green status of species is thinking about how do we recover species functions in the landscape, and how do we have a way to measure that? So as I said, with the red list, we've had this wonderful barometer of extinction risk for a species that has guided conservation very successfully for many years. However, let me introduce a hypothetical counterpart to our spectrum of extinction, a hypothetical spectrum of recovery of a species that goes from 0 to 100%, where a species with a recovery spectrum of 0% is extinct, and a species with 100% is considered a fully recovered species, whatever that means. So it's quite clear to see, I think, how the extinct and extinct in the wild categories of the red list map onto our spectrum of recovery. Obviously, a species that's extinct or extinct in the wild is going to be pretty close to the 0% end of our hypothetical recovery spectrum. But what we wanted to do with the green status of species is think about, if a species is least concern in terms of extinction risk, where does it fall on this recovery spectrum? Is there a clear mapping of it? Because you could argue that a least concerned species could be fully recovered, but it might also be anywhere else on that spectrum. There wasn't a scientific answer to that question. So to summarize how we've been thinking about conservation success in the past, extinction is something that we want to avoid. And we've used the red list to measure how good are we at avoiding extinction for a species. However, recovery is something we want to achieve, and we need a different way of thinking about that and how to measure that recovery. We need a new metric, and so the green status of species was developed to fill that void. And the green status of species makes us think about how close to recovery is the species currently, and how close could we possibly get in the future. As I said, in 2012, there was a resolution of IUCN members to develop something like a green status of species. We were trying to think about how to define conservation success for a species. And originally, the green status of species was called the green list of species. So you might have heard it referred to in that way, but we do call it the green status of species now. And then between 2013 and 2021, there were many global consultations with lots of stakeholders, scientists, conservationists, end users. Some of you were part of those consultations, so thank you very much for helping us develop this framework. And then early last year in 2021, the standard was launched. The methods of how to measure species recovery, what the green status of species was, those methods were agreed by IUCN and published online. And I'm happy to send a link to our standard, which you can see pictured here, which lays out the basic methods for the green status of species. I'm very happy to send that to anyone who would like a copy. Now, the green status has two primary aims. The first is to measure species recovery. And the second is to assess the impact of and incentivize conservation action. So I'm going to quickly explain how we do both of those things with the green status. I'll focus on the first. How does the green status actually measure species recovery? So in that standard that I mentioned just now, we propose a definition for a fully recovered species. So according to the green status, a species is fully recovered if it is viable and ecologically functional in each part of its indigenous and expected additional range. Now, there are lots of terms in that definition. I promise I will explain what they mean. But for now, let's take this definition and let's map it onto our hypothetical spectrum of recovery, which has now been turned into our y-axis here. So we have our definition of a fully recovered species. If the species, or if a species meets this definition, it gets 100%. However, a species is most likely going to be somewhere along that spectrum. We might not be lucky enough to have a species that is at 100% of full recovery. And so using the degree to which a species meets the criteria in that definition of a fully recovered species, we can start to map where the species recovery is, what score it is from 0 to 100%. And just like with the red list, it can be easier to communicate things using categories. So there are new categories introduced by the green status of species that correspond to ranges of that species recovery score. So we have at 100% a fully recovered or non-depleted species. Moving down away from 100% towards 0, we have the categories slightly depleted, moderately depleted, largely depleted, and critically depleted. And then finally, if that score goes all the way down to 0%, we have a species that is either extinct in the wild or extinct. So you're probably wondering, how is this species recovery score calculated? How do we take that definition and translate it into a percentage? So let's look back at that definition. And I've colored all of the different, the key parts of that definition that need a bit more explaining. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is, what do we mean by the indigenous range of a species? So a species has to be viable and functional throughout all parts of its indigenous range. What is the indigenous range? So, and again, I apologize for all these terrestrial examples in this talk. I'm primarily a terrestrial ecologist. But the indigenous range is the known or inferred distribution of the species prior to major human impacts. So before humans started significantly altering the abundance or distribution of the species, where was that species found? And for a lot of species, that means that the indigenous range is much larger than the current occupied range of the species. So for example, the Javan rhino, you can see on this map, there's a lot of light green. These are areas the rhino inhabited prior to major human impacts. Currently, it is found only in this tiny green speck. So, a very tiny proportion of its original range is where the rhino is currently found. However, if we were to do a green status assessment of the rhino, we would be considering all of the previously occupied range as part of that indigenous range in that definition of fully recovered. Now, the definition also talks about parts of the indigenous range, each part of the indigenous range. And in the green status, we give parts of the range a special name, spatial units. And so the indigenous range, where that species was found prior to major impacts, is broken up into chunks that make biological or ecological or management sense. So, a logical way to subdivide the range into pieces. And the reason we wanted to include the concept of the range of spatial units is to capture variation and incentivize recovery across all parts of the range. Because as you know, species status is not homogeneous across its range. A species could be doing very well in some parts of its range, but doing very poorly in others. And so we wanted to have some way to capture that in our assessment of how close to recovery is a species. So for one of the preliminary assessments that we did with the marine turtle specialist group, we did a leatherback preliminary assessment, and they chose these colored blobs as their spatial units. So each of these colored blobs represents a genetically distinct part of the leatherback population. And that was a very logical way to think about the spatial units and breaking up the range for that species. Now, considering that we know what the indigenous range is, we know the parts of the range, the definition of a fully recovered species now says that a species must be viable in each of these parts of the range, in each spatial unit. And that one is actually quite straightforward, especially for those of you who are very familiar with the red list. So a viable species, that simply means that we have applied the red list criteria to a spatial unit using the regional guidelines, so slightly different than the global guidelines, but not by very much. And we've come out with an assessment of least concern or near threatened and not declining. So that's a very straightforward link between the red list and the green status. And of course, this is really important because even though we are thinking about more than just extinction risk when we're thinking about species recovery, we also want to recognize that the first goal of successful conservation is stabilizing species, is preventing extinction of species. So viability has to be included when we're thinking about species recovery. And then finally, the last part of our definition of a fully recovered species is that a fully recovered species should be ecologically functional in every spatial unit. So what do we mean by ecologically functional? Honestly, this is one of the trickier parts of the assessment, in my opinion. So an ecologically functional species should be exhibiting its full range of ecological interactions, functions, and other roles in the ecosystem. For some species, this can be quite straightforward to assess. For strongly interacting species, for example, you might have a very clear relationship between reduced abundance or characteristics of that species, and then see changes propagated throughout the ecosystem. So one classic example is the sea otter, sea urchin, kelp trophic cascade that's been documented in the literature. If you have sea otters dropping below a certain abundance, then the urchin abundance increases, kelp forests are deforested, and you have this state change in the ecosystem. And so there's a very clear relationship between how many otters do we need to have them maintain their ecological function of maintaining those trophic relationships. If only it were that simple for many species. For many species that are not strongly interacting, it can be a little bit trickier. So we've written a paper about how you can think about function for species. If you want to get into more detail, you can check out this paper here. But some ways you could think about it is either through observation of the function, as we've seen with our sea otters. You could think about function as being no observation of dysfunction. So if we don't see negative things happening in the ecosystem that we would link to the functioning of the species, we assume the species is functional, or there are various proxies that you can use. But again, this is a bit too technical for me to get into on this workshop, but I'll be happy to chat about it more with anyone who's interested. So just to remind you, we have our definition of a fully recovered species. We have our color terms that have now been defined, and we can see how that maps onto our species recovery score axis and our species recovery categories. So thus far, the green status is quite new, but we've had a lot of support from the IUCN specialist group community. And at least preliminarily, we've measured over 200 species. We've assessed the green status of over 200 species and assigned them to species recovery categories. And so in the species we've tested so far, including the whale shark, which Gonzo will tell us more about later on in the program, we see the whole spectrum of species recovery categories represented. And so what's really exciting about this is now we have new language to talk about species recovery. When we talk about what is the conservation status of a species, we can now not only talk about their red list category, but also their green status category, their recovery category. So now we have language to say, this species is least concern, but it is largely depleted, allowing us to know that there is more conservation action, perhaps, that needs to happen for this species, or there's more that can be done for this species. And what's really interesting is that the species recovery score is correlated with red list category, but it's not a perfect prediction. So in this figure, we have our red list categories on the x-axis, so lower risk of extinction on the left and higher risk of extinction on the right. And then, on the y-axis, we have our species recovery score. And what you can see is that in general, species with a higher risk of extinction tend to have a lower species recovery score, but it's not a one-to-one relationship. And so this green horizontal line represents species that have the exact same species recovery score, but are found across all those different red list categories. So the green status is telling us new information about how a species is doing. It's not just a red list in reverse. And I think that's really exciting. So I've run through the first aim of the green status of species. How does the green status measure species recovery? And in my few minutes I have left, I'm just going to quickly touch on how the green status achieves its second aim, which is to assess the impact of and incentivize conservation action. So we're all familiar with this figure by now. The first part of my talk, I was talking about how do we know how a species is doing right now in terms of its recovery status? What is its current species recovery score? However, one thing that you can do with the green status of species framework is think about a different scenario. What would the species score be today if no conservation action had been taken in the past? That's represented by that other dot on the figure. And the difference between how the species is actually doing, how we observe it to be doing, and how we expect it would have fared without conservation gives us a measurement called the conservation legacy. And I think this can be really powerful because so often in conservation, we put in a lot of work to maintain a species at a certain level. We feel like we're running as fast as we can to stay in the same place. But with a measure like conservation legacy, some of that conservation impact can actually be measured and communicated. So we might not have seen an actual improvement in species numbers despite lots of conservation effort. However, if we hadn't taken those actions, these species would be in a much worse place. And I think that's a really powerful message to communicate. We can also think into the future and think how we expect conservation to impact a species over time. So for example, in a relatively short time frame, 10 years, we can think about what would happen to the species if all conservation actions stopped today. And this gives us a measure called conservation dependence. This can be potentially really important if we think about species that are at risk of losing protections, or even species that are being moved to a lower risk extinction category on the red list. So for example, going from critically endangered to endangered. Most of us would think this is something to celebrate, but the perverse reality is that sometimes when a species moves to a low risk of extinction, enthusiasm and funding for its conservation can weaken. But with a measure like conservation dependence, we can show that even though we've made progress, sustained effort is still required to help this species. Over that same time frame, 10 years, we can think about how the conservation actions that are currently in place or are planned to happen over that time frame are expected to boost the species recovery score. And this gives us a measure called conservation gain. And so this can be quite incentivizing to people working on the ground, thinking about how your actions are going to potentially boost that species. It helps ground our expectations in reality a little bit, thinking realistically, what can we achieve over this time frame? And it's also a time frame that lines up pretty well with most or many funders' sort of time frames as well. So it can be used to communicate impact in that way. And then finally, we could even think much longer term. So thinking about the next 100 years of conservation for a species. And we can do a bit of a thought experiment. If everything went right for this species, if we had all of the funding we could want, if we had all of the volunteer power we could want, what could we achieve for the species within 100 years? Where could the species be reintroduced? Where could habitats be restored? And so sort of what is the maximum recovery potential of a species? Now, obviously, this has to be grounded in reality. When we're thinking about the recovery potential of a species, we're not ignoring climate change. We're not ignoring human population growth and development, but we are thinking if we had all the support for conservation for this species that we wanted, what could we do? And that can be a really powerful and inspiring thing. That's all I'm going to say about these conservation impact metrics, because I know the other speakers are going to actually apply these to the species that they have assessed. So stay tuned for more. And I'm just going to, oh, Rima?
No, go for it.
Yeah. So yes, a few take-home messages. The green status assesses recovery and conservation impact, as I hope I've shown. I hope I've also shown that the recovery is not the opposite or inverse of extinction risk. And the green status is not just a list of recovered species. So what's next? The Red List website, as Rima showed, has been updated with green status information. So over the next few years, you're going to see more and more of these assessments popping up online. We're also currently developing an online training that will make the methods available to a much larger group of people, people who can't attend workshops like this all over the world. We're also developing national guidelines. So just like there are national applications of the Red List, soon there will be national applications of the green status. And most importantly, over the next decade, we want to really scale up the number of assessments that have been done so that we can start making really important inferences about recovery and impact on a global scale. And I very much hope that the Shark Specialist Group will continue to be a part of that effort. So thanks very much. I have my contact information here. And just a moment, thanks to all of the members of the Green Status Task Force and the partners and donors who have supported us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Molly. That was great. And congratulations on all the progress that you've made in the last few years. It's really impressive. Carlos, I'll let you jump in and talk about the blue sharks. But like I said, if anyone has any questions, please make sure you enter them in the chat and we can take them at the end of the seminar. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to share my screens, okay? You can hear me? Okay. Let me know when you can see my screen. Okay. Okay, I'm going to be quickly. Hello, everybody. My name is Carlos Polo. I am marine biologist too. I'm going to show you a preliminary assessment for blue shark because it's not to be complete. I just start to the real assessment for to be published at the end of this year. I just filmed the form yesterday. I just sent for Molly. Thank you for Molly. Nice to meet you again. So I think that Molly explained in a general way all the steps that we're taking account to make the assessment for the green status. So what can I choose for blue shark? Because the blue shark is the only species that I'm working for my PhD, so I have more information for some of them. So when the first step that we can determine the range. So this species is a more cosmopolitan species, so you know that we can find in tropical and temperate water. So that's and exists information more in the different areas about that. So after that, we have to separate the units, the information in different spatial units. So I propose different 5 spatial units separated for areas like Northwest Atlantic, Canada, Western North Atlantic, North Pacific, and Southwestern Pacific. Even I would like to include more the information for the Pacific, but at that moment, but I make the assessment was at the end of 2019, I remember. I don't have more information. So I recovered all information that we can use for even that. I reviewed the proposal for the CMS listing appendix 2 for blue shark. So most of them is coming for that because they include all information about what is happening with this species in different area. So and I include what is the estimation of the population of the clients for different area, what happened with the about information we have for fisheries, what is the abundance that we have on different area, but doesn't exist any specific regulation for this species. Everybody knows that's the only I think so. Probably I am wrong, but the only assessment, the only regulation that I know about that blue shark was proposed in the last year in 2020 for ICAT. They proposed like a quota for blue shark in the Atlantic. So after that, I saw when you propose different spatial units, you can propose what is the status for that spatial units when you make the green assessment. I agree, Molly, that's okay. So when we have defined and quantified the functionality, they have different options that you can define on what is the criteria that you can use. I use trophic function because I seek different information about the trophic function that have the blue shark in this area. So this is a predator that used to eat more cephalopods and teleots. But most of them is the principal prey are dominated for cephalopods. So most of them in the North Pacific and even the in the Eastern Pacific and tropical Pacific, they used to eat the same. So apparently that species have a different segregation for sex and like a maturity state. So that was proposed for Nakano in 2019. They have different segregation between males and females. Apparently the males could be more easy to find in oceanic water, but the immature males is common to find in coastal water because that could be related for reproduction aspect, or even for trying to find different kind of food. And this model have tested for different other outdoor for Oñate and Bogue with different tools like a fisheries assessment, or even I tried to corroborate that using trophic tools like stabilized analysis, and that's apparently is correct. They confirm that apparent segregation. And after that, we can use all the tools that we have in the Excel form, and we can find this is part of the paper that was published the last time. So that's include the information for the blue shark. So the blue shark is and the release is treatment now. They have the but for the green stature apparently is moderate depleted. They have a conservation legacy high and dependency conservation high. So that's represent that in this moment this species apparently have a depends on different measure of conservation that apparently is in general, because we doesn't exist a specific conservation measure for them. But gain conservation apparently can negative, and the potential recovery apparently negative. That's it. I can show you the graph in a few moments. So that could be related because probably we need more information. The last part of the assessment, I don't have the red list assessment. That's what I need to work. So the idea is to work in that part to be finished in December of this year and know what happened with this species. Even now, I have more information now for the South Pacific for the blue shark. So the different information coming from Chile, Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia, because now I'm working with CPPS and ITTC. So they collect more information now that try to review and include that area to know what's information we can introduce for the assessment. So that is the picture that we can find for the blue shark. So that's the conservation legacy. So if I doesn't work, the X, that is the base estimate that we can find for each criterion. So and the other values is like the minimum and maximum value that we can find for them. And you can see that the last two criteria like gain conservancy and predicted conservation is negative. So that could be, I believe that could be related because you don't have a specific plan that could be addressed for that species in this moment. So the idea is for let's give an idea what happened with this species and what is the way that we can to try to go and try to help this species for now. So that's it. I just quickly because I know that Gonzalo and the other colleagues have more time to talk about that.
Thank you, Carlos. Gonzo, do you want to start yeah?
Yep. Give me 1 second. No. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Rima. Thank you, Alex, for organizing. Thank you, Molly, for that great introduction. I think you save us a bit of a pain going through the steps and processes of the green status. Today, I wanted to take a little bit of an opportunity to highlight some of maybe the nitty-gritty that we came to with the whale shark and where a lot of our attention was spent instead of going through the whole process. I thought that might be a little bit useful. So similar to Carlos, obviously the whale shark is quite a circumglobally distributed species. So when we started defining the indigenous range, obviously we have equatorial and warm temperate waters for the whale shark with a polewards expansion due to climate change and seasonal variability. So where we really wanted to kind of try and make an impact and try and understand what was really going on a more kind of granular delineation was on the spatial units as defined by the green status. So traditionally, the whale shark, we know from various genetic studies that there's an Atlantic and an Indo-Pacific population, with an inference that about 25% of whale sharks are in the Atlantic and about 75% in the Indo-Pacific. Obviously, this is a huge area spanning multiple jurisdictions. So we wanted to define this into smaller kind of spatial units. So we split the Indo-Pacific into 4 spatial units, essentially. And we first started, obviously, with the genetics in the Atlantic, Indo-Pacific, and then we dove into the Indo-Pacific section, and we split this based on short to midterm whale shark connectivity data that we have. And I called it short to midterm because whale sharks have pretty long generation times. So for example, from movements that we have from telemetry and photo ID data across the eastern coast of Africa, in the Arabian Sea, and within, say, Southeast Asia. So from these areas, we know that these animals are, for at least a big chunk of their time period, they're residing or not moving too far away from these geographical units. So we then kind of classified that some of these smaller spatial units had similar threat profiles. And they had also similar recommendation kind of conservation actions. So we started to group together kind of these like 4 sections. We were also aware of the presence of existing management structures that are relevant to shark conservation, like RFMOs. So as you can see from our Pacific spatial unit delineation, we use the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission Western Boundary. And this was trying to fit in what we know about the species, what they're doing in this smaller kind of geographical ranges, what conservation action is there, what their threats are, and if there are management options we can opt in that might help in the overall planning and conservation action of a species, it'd be beneficial from a purely management point of view as well, because obviously there's no physical borders in any of these spatial units. So with that in mind, we then applied our red list criteria to the different spatial units and also assigned the state from the green status. So if they were absent, present, viable, or functional. And essentially our species recovery score for the whale shark was 29, ranging from 25 to 37. This is across all spatial units. And we then kind of, as Molly described, we apply these numbers to some of the different scenarios to calculate how conservation impact metrics might affect the whale shark. So we actually saw a pretty positive kind of long-term potential of, or rather the recovery potential of the whale shark. And this has to do with what was traditionally kind of targeted large-scale fisheries for whale sharks kind of have pretty much stopped as far as we know. So if we have this kind of conservation and management action in place over 100 years or so, we should have a pretty well-recovered population of whale sharks. We also saw that in the future conservation, the conservation gate was actually medium, kind of 26%, as you can see here. And that was because some of the targeted fisheries were still fairly contemporary. So we're kind of talking 2000s into the 2010s. So in a 10-year time scale, whatever stopped those targeted fisheries would obviously would still be reflected now. So yeah, so this is a brief kind of description of how we went around with the whale shark. But as I said, I think the major kind of focus for us was getting those spatial units to a place where we could have more of an informed information or more detail into these smaller sections that would be relevant for conservation and management as well. So I'm happy to take any questions after Charlie's talk. Back to you, Rima. Thank you.
Thank you, Gonzo. I was just checking. Are you sharing Charlie's talk? Are you happy to put that on?
Happy to do so. Yeah, give me one second.
So that's a recording, and Charlie, obviously it's a bit late for him in Australia, so he wasn't able to join us live, but he was able to send in a recording of the work that he did for the banded wobbegong. Thank you, Gonzo.
No worries. Okay. Oh, I lost you, sorry. Here we go.
Good afternoon, good evening, or good
Can you guys hear that? Sorry, before I go ahead. Yeah.
morning, depending on which time zone you are at the moment. I wish I was here face to face, or I should say probably screen to screen, but unfortunately with the time difference, I think it's about 11 p.m. For me at the moment, and I thought it'd be safer to actually pre-record this presentation. First, I would like to thank Rima for inviting me and offering me the opportunity to go through this case study for the Wobbegons, for the green status, but also Molly Grace for going through this whole process and taking the lead on this really good work in relation to the green status. I particularly thought that the idea of being able to look at how conservation measures can influence the conservation status currently or in the future is what really attracted me to this idea of going beyond the red list, but looking at the benefits of the various conservation measures that can be put in place. I decided to do a case study on the Wobbegong. Obviously, it's a species that's always been close to my heart in a way, because I did my PhD on the species, but also because I thought it'd be interesting to look at how the story of the Wobbegong will be reflected in the conservation status. And I say that because the Wobbegong story in Australia is a bit of a positive story. It's a bit of a success story because we've seen basically an uplisting of several species of Wobbegongs because of some of the conservation measures or regulations that were put in place by the New South Wales government to better manage the Wobbegong fishery. So I thought it would be interesting to see how that would be reflected in the whole green status process. So Wobbegong sharks, or most species of Wobbegong sharks, are endemic to Australia. And this species, the Gulf Wobbegong, it certainly is endemic to Australia, and it's mostly found in temperate or warm temperate Australia. It is considered to have 4 different subunits for that green status process, with the species being commercially targeted in 2 of these 4 subunits. And here are some of the photos that I took during my PhD that showcase some of the catches of these Wobbegongs from New South Wales waters. And whilst the fishery is not huge, it certainly is being big enough to warrant some concerns in terms of the population status of that banded or Gulf Wobbegong. What I mean by this is that basically this graph really nicely illustrates this. If you look at the catch of 4 Wobbegongs in New South Wales, you can see that it went from about 120 tons per year, which again isn't massive, but it's not nothing either, down to about 60 tons per year in about kind of 10 to 15 years. And this kind of 50% reduction in catches, as well as the life histories of Wobbegong suggesting a triennial reproductive cycle, so where Wobbegongs would only give birth every 3 years, kind of led to these concerns about the population status or conservation status of Wobbegongs, and led to the Wobbegong species being listed as vulnerable in New South Wales because of that decrease or decline in abundance or in catches in New South Wales. And a bit of a sidebar here, you've got a different scientific name here. This is the Oryctolobus ornatus, but it turns out that we actually have 2 different species embedded in this one assessment, with the banded Wobbegong actually being Oryctolobus halei, and the Oryctolobus ornatus being the ornate Wobbegong, which is a smaller version of that Gulf or banded Wobbegong as well. So what happens after this is that because of these concerns there, I ended up doing my PhD. My PhD happened around basically this kind of time period. And at the end of my PhD, I guess the data that we were able to collect to show the government led to the New South Wales government imposing new rules or new regulation to the fisheries, both in terms of the recreational catches as well as commercial catches. In terms of recreational catches, Wobbegongs were no longer allowed to be caught recreationally. In terms of the commercial fisheries, there was a new bag limit that wasn't existing before, with a bag limit of a maximum of 6 Wobbegongs. And there also was a minimum size limit of 130 centimeters, which also reduced the number of Wobbegongs being caught. But combined, these two regulations led to commercial fishers no longer targeting wobbegong. So this used to be a targeted fishery for a few commercial fishermen. Because of the bag limit and the minimum size limit, it was no longer economically viable to go out specifically targeted wobbegong. So what happens after this new regulation around 2007 is that basically there was no longer any targeting of wobbegong, with the catches basically remaining constant, but remaining constant at a low level. And I'm sure some of you would straight away pick up that this is only total catches and it doesn't account effort, which is something quite important in fisheries management. But the effort data for this fishery is not very accurate, and it doesn't really represent what has been going on, because the only effort data that we have is number of days fished, not accounting for the number of hooks being used. So that one person targeting wobbegongs using 60 hooks would be considered an effort of 1 day, which would be the same for somebody that wasn't targeting wobbegongs, but catching one wobby as part of a different fishery. That would also be considered as a 1 day of fishing effort. So unfortunately, effort data is not very reliable, but just from talking to the managers, as well as talking from the fishing industry, we're able to kind of reconstruct some of these catches and understand that the further decline down here in the low catches is not a reflection of the population not recovering, but is a reflection of the effort and the targeting of these wobbegong no longer occurring around this period compared to this period when we did see that decline in catches, during which there was a relatively similar effort throughout this period here. So what does that mean for the green status? Well, this is, as I said, one of these success stories when we've got a case of the Gulf wobbegong or Oryctolagus heli being considered to have fully recovered. If you look at the four metrics here that Molly would have described, we can see that from a conservation legacy or dependence, we actually have a medium impact. And from a conservation gain or recovery potential, we actually have a zero impact. And I'll explain why this is the case. In case of the conservation legacy, what it basically represents is basically what would have happened if we didn't have any fishing regulations. Well, in the case of the wobbegongs, or the banded or Gulf wobbegong, basically if it wasn't for these fishing regulations that New South Wales DPI put in place, we expect that the species would actually still be threatened and still be considered vulnerable in New South Wales. We're not getting up to a high, and we're seeing this as a medium, and that is because the commercial targeting in this regulation are only really relevant for 2 out of the subunits for the species. So you can see here a map of the entire distribution of the Oryctolagus heli here, that New South Wales commercial fisheries was really relevant for 2 of the subunits in New South Wales. Similarly, in the case of conservation dependence, what we're finding is that if we were to stop these regulations and basically allowing kind of a free-for-all again for wobbegongs, what we'd expect is that the species would again become maybe non-functional over a 10-year period. So basically the population remaining at fully recovered is dependent on the conservation measures that are currently in place. Again, it is put down as a medium and not high, because this is really only applicable to 2 of the 4 subunits of wobbegongs. Now, in terms of conservation gain and recovery potential, I guess this is what happens when you fully recover the species, is that the species is already considered to be fully recovered, so that we wouldn't gain anything further by adding additional conservation measures. So what this is basically assuming is that we're maintaining the current conservation measures or the current regulations, but that if we were to do so, adding new conservation measures would not basically mean anything, since the population is already fully recovered. In the case of the recovery potential, again, over the next 100 years, we expect that the species will continue to be fully recovered thanks to the current conservation measures, and we don't expect climate change to be a threat to the species. We did think that there might be an extension of the range of the wobbegongs due to potentially climate change, with the species potentially ended up maybe in Tasmania, and if that was the case, obviously this there might be a range extension of the species down to Tasmanian waters, but this is not expected again to be to the point of being a threat to the species. So that's it for the Gulf or banded wobbegong, Oryctolabius halei. Again, it's a bit of a success story and a positive kind of story, where you can see how conservation measures put in place by the government has led to species that were considered to be vulnerable, especially in New South Wales, to be now considered as least concern and fully recovered thanks to these conservation measures. So I'll leave it to this with a few photos showing, I guess, some of the predation of wobbegongs, which has been talked about in the past and I found quite interesting. But also I've left my email address here if you have any questions or want to talk about wobbegongs a bit more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gonzo, for sharing that. And thank you, Charlie, if you see this recording. There are a few questions in the chat. Alifa is asking, we may not have a lot of data. Or Alifa, do you want to ask your question if you're still online?
Hi, yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. That was very interesting, Molly, Carlos, and everyone else. My question is pretty simple. Even with red list data, we have seen that many of the species are data poor. And interestingly, in some places, probably we have some data, and in some other places, we don't have anything. So when you're dealing with something like, it seems like a lot of quantitative analysis. So when you're doing something like this, how do you deal with such a scenario where a species is globally distributed, but you have data from one part of the world, and for the other parts, you don't have much? And the next question is, when we are trying to predict the future of a species in terms of if we have all the resources in place, where the species would stand in a recovery plan, is this analysis quantitative or qualitative? Thank you.
I can take a stab at those, Rima. Thank you for the questions, Alifa. So for the first question about uncertainty, definitely plays into every assessment that's done, I think, and maybe Gonzo or Carlos can talk about how it affected their assessments. But how we deal with that in the methods of the assessment is that for every decision you have to make, you have to give a best estimate, but also a least likely and a most likely a pessimistic and an optimistic bounds of uncertainty. And so that uncertainty is propagated throughout the assessment. And so if you really didn't know anything about a particular spatial unit, maybe there's a functional population there, maybe they've been extirpated, but we just can't access that area, you can include that uncertainty and it gets propagated in the chat. So if anyone is interested in actually playing around with this and seeing how the assessment works, there is a web page on the Red List website that has all of the guidance documents and the actual assessment materials. And so you're very welcome to see how uncertainty is dealt with in the actual tools that we use. And Gonzo and Carlos both showed bits from those tools in their talks. Do Gonzo or Carlos have anything to add before I talk about future scenarios?
Yeah, hi, Alifa. Thanks for your question. Yeah, we had to, there is a lot of uncertainty, I think for the whale shark and the conservation gain and the legacy, for example, for the status of the targeted fisheries from China, we kind of, we didn't know. We have no information since like a decade ago or so. So yeah, we kind of go with the best available information. And like Molly said, we have an upper and a lower bound. And hopefully, not hopefully, but I presume reality kind of falls somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I agree with Gonzalo and Molly. So when depend the information that you have, you can use that information for that unit tab I don't shoot it about the bonnethead hammerhead shark. That include only 2 or 3 units because they have information for only that 2 or 3 units. So you have more information for that area. That's your grid assessment for that area, and try to use the best that you have.
Yeah, I completely agree. And then I should say that I simplified things quite a bit in my talk, but if the uncertainty is big enough, you can get an indeterminate outcome for the species recovery category or any of the conservation impact metrics. And so we're not trying to, I guess, pretend that we know more than we do, but that doesn't make for a very exciting talk, I think, to talk about all the uncertainty. Regarding your other question about thinking about future scenarios and how that's done, in my ideal world, it would all be done quantitatively, but not every assessment has the bandwidth or the capacity to do that. And so it can be done qualitatively. Often it is done qualitatively, but there's lots of guidance about the level of justification and the inferences that you are using to support those future projections. And I actually we published a paper last year. It's open access. That describes ways that you can make these future predictions qualitatively, but still be following a robust and replicable method. So if anyone's interested in that, I welcome you to have a look. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just the last one that, have you thought about using proxy data where there is no actual species data, for example, fisheries, people, coastal, stuff like that?
I think, especially in the marine realm, this is probably extremely relevant. And I think it would just come down to the justification of it again. And, can we make the leap from proxy data to telling us something about how the populations are doing? But if you can do that reliably or with a certain level of documented uncertainty, I don't see why not.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Alifa. I'm conscious of time, but we do have 2 questions, if you don't mind staying for a couple of minutes. Muazzam, do you want to ask your question? Or I may ask it, Gonzo. It probably goes to you, but in terms of what will... Oh, go for it. Okay. Thank you, Muazzam.
Thank you. Thank you, Ima. Thank you, everyone. I'm wondering that there are some measures that has been taken to recovery for a species, like some fisheries have practically been stopped because of the legal action, because of the change in attitude. But at the same time, the other factors, like I'm just quoting the example of, say, the whale shark, which is like in case of Pakistan, it has not been commercially harvested since 1970, which is almost about 4 decades, but still the bycatch is increasing because the fishing gears are more efficient. Although there are training, there are the entrapped animal being released, but the impact of stopping our legal fishing is almost compensated by the other negative factors. So how does this fit into when we are talking about green, ranking of them in this particular scenario we are talking about? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Muazzam, for your question. So when we assess the Western Indian Ocean Spatial Unit, we did actually put this into the uncertainty. So the level of bycatch in net fisheries in the Western Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea as well, because it was similar. It was quite high. So in our scenario, kind of worst case scenario, if you will, current assessment would be critically endangered for that spatial unit for whale sharks. And that had to do with kind of persistent, if you will, persistent bycatch issues in that spatial unit.
Thank you, Gonzo. There's another question by Heike. Heike, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Thank you very much. Very interesting webinar. My question is, I was wondering, how do you address aspects of shifting baselines, especially in terms of the indigenous range? Because sometimes we still don't know where they have been, but they're already extirpated, at least for some elasmobranchs. And yeah, how do you put that into the overall evaluation? Because it might be then to the area too small, and then the recovery goal also too low.
Thank you for your question, Heike. And it's interesting because I think you're the first person who said that the indigenous range might be too small. Usually people say that the indigenous range is too big and it's too much of a recovery effort. It is important to say that this is a scientific assessment, not a conservation recommendation. So, our goal is not necessarily restoring throughout the indigenous range, but, what could be achieved for the species realistically. But your point about shifting baselines is really important. The reason we wanted to include indigenous range was because to combat shifting baselines for where species are found and how species are doing. And you're really right that it can be challenging to, first of all, to figure out when did humans really start impacting a species. That's much more obvious for some species than others. And then even if where was the species at that time. And at this point, we only know what we know. It's probably not possible to perfectly map out the indigenous range for every species, but there's a couple things we're doing in that regard. So we currently have a working group that's actually collaborating with historical ecologists, paleoecologists, and present-day ecologists to try and figure out a modeling framework that's easy to use so that people could input as much data as is known and as available, and in a standardized way, have a basic rough draft of what an indigenous range for the species might be. So that's in the works. And also what's really interesting is that when you're thinking about, historical distributions of species, you can start to use some really unconventional sources of information. So whether that is, for commercially traded species, logbooks, restaurant menus for fishery species. These are things that have been done in the past. And so you can get creative about it, but I agree that it's going to be harder for some species than others.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Pilar, I think Pilar will probably be the last question that we take. Pilar, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Well, my question is if you used for the assessment on so if you go deep with the regulations, because, for example, in my region, in the West Atlantic, we have a lot of countries with a lot of regulations, but not any enforcement. So, for example, I don't know, Honduras with a shark sanctuary, but there is no enforcement, is not working this kind of regulation. In Mexico is the same. So how do you put inside of this assessment this kind of problems? Because, well, yeah, we can think that there are very good regulations, but not all these regulations have a lot of, not all the countries have enforcement, and the regulations are not really working on the conservation of the species. So how do you analyze this? Or if you only put the regulations that are showing some kind of results in each country, or I don't know, that is my question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you, Pilar. So one thing that we hope to be able to do in 10 years, 20 years time is to have enough of these assessments done that we can start to see, based on conservation legacy, so impact of past conservation, which conservation actions have been effective and where, in what contexts, in what regions, for what species. But the only way we can do that is to really critically evaluate, have these conservation actions been having the impact that we wanted them to have? What barriers have been in place to them having the impact? And so all of those factors are considered when you are mapping out your scenarios in this assessment to figure out, have these conservation actions had impact? And so in that paper that I sent the link to, there's a process that you can follow of thinking about, what factors were in place that would, make us think that this action was successful, and which factors were in place that would be combating the effectiveness of that action, and just documenting all of those things so that you can really critically evaluate Has this been successful, or do we need to try something else? That's where it is at this point.
Okay, thank you very much, Molly.
Thank you. And we just have one last comment from Yasuko, which is saying that regarding highly migratory species like blue sharks and whale sharks, that they would recommend to take into account the brand new abundance indices and future projections that are discussed at regional fisheries management organizations in their stock assessments. And just to highlight that some of the blue shark information that was projected was potentially older information that should be updated. Okay, we're 8 minutes over. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I would like to thank Alex, our program officer, for organizing this, Molly, Carlos, Gonzo, and Charlie for taking the time to present. And I'm really excited about this new tool. I think it's going to be a very steep learning curve for sharks and rays. So again, it's only been 8 species, but 1,250 to go plus. Exciting times, but I think, yeah, lots to learn from how to apply it and for which species. So thank you all for joining us, and the recording will be made available. I'll send a link to all of the IUCN SSG members so that they can also have access to it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rima. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Rima.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Thank you, Molly. Nice to meet you. Bye-bye.
For coming, and feel free to email me with any questions.
Bye, thank you.